As I've gotten older, I've learned that balance isn't just about standing steady. It's about how I move through each day. Long before I ever reached for a cane, these quiet habits began protecting my confidence, my independence, and my sense of control. There was a time when movement happened without negotiation. The body rose when it needed to, reached without hesitation, turned without thought. We didn't ask ourselves how it felt to stand up or whether our feet were ready to carry us across the room. Movement was simply there, like breath, unnoticed because it was reliable. Aging has a way of quietly changing that relationship. It doesn't arrive all at once, and it rarely announces itself. Instead, it shows up in small pauses, in moments where the body asks for a little more attention than it used to. I noticed it first in the mornings. Not pain, exactly, just a sense that my body needed warming up, like an old house on a cold day. I could no longer jump straight into motion without consequence. At first, I resisted that truth. I waited until I felt ready to move, and more often than not, that readiness never came. The less I moved, the heavier my body felt. The heavier it felt, the more cautious I became. Without realizing it, I was teaching my body to be still, and stillness, when it becomes habitual, has a way of dulling balance. What changed everything was letting go of the idea that movement had to look like effort. I stopped thinking of movement as exercise and started seeing it as conversation, a way of checking in with my body each day, asking what it was capable of in that moment, and responding with patience instead of expectation. Movement didn't need to impress anyone. It didn't need to build strength quickly or burn energy. It just needed to happen. I began with the smallest things, standing up a little more slowly and noticing the shift of weight through my feet, reaching my arms overhead not to stretch aggressively but to remind my shoulders they were still part of me, walking from one room to another without rushing, letting each step land fully before the next one followed. These movements were gentle, almost quiet, but they woke something up that had been sleeping. There is a kind of awareness that returns when the body is used regularly, even softly. Joints feel less surprised by motion. Muscles respond instead of resisting. The floor beneath your feet starts to feel familiar again, not something to fear, but something to trust. Balance doesn't improve because you train it directly. It improves because the body remembers how to cooperate. What struck me most was how these small movements affected my confidence. I wasn't doing more, but I felt more capable. There was less hesitation when I reached for something on a shelf. Less uncertainty when I turned quickly to answer the phone. The body had been reminded day after day that it was still involved in life, not just along for the ride. I also learned that consistency mattered far more than intensity. A little movement every day did more for my balance than occasional bursts of effort, followed by long stretches of inactivity. The body responds to rhythm. When movement becomes part of the day, woven into ordinary moments, it stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like care. Some days, movement was nothing more than standing by the window and shifting my weight from one foot to the other while watching the light change outside. Other days, it was a slow walk down the block, paying attention to how the ground felt beneath me. There was no schedule to keep, no standard to meet, only a quiet agreement with myself to keep moving in ways that felt respectful. Over time, I noticed that fear began to loosen its grip. Fear of falling often grows in stillness, when the body feels unfamiliar and unpredictable. Movement restores familiarity. It reminds you that you know how to be in your body, even if that knowledge now requires more patience than it once did. I stopped measuring my days by how much I accomplished, and started measuring them by how present I felt in my own skin. Movement became a form of reassurance, a way of saying, gently but firmly, that I was still here, still participating, still capable of responding to the world around me. This wasn't about defying age or reclaiming youth. It was about honoring the body I had now, not the one I remembered. Gentle movement became a bridge between who I had been and who I was becoming. It allowed balance to develop naturally, without force, without fear. As this habit settled in, something unexpected happened. I began to trust my body again, not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. And familiarity, I learned, is one of the strongest foundations balance can rest on. Once movement became a regular part of my days again, something else began to surface. I realized that movement alone wasn't the whole story. The way I moved mattered just as much. I had spent years walking quickly, standing without thought, turning sharply as if my body would always keep up. That habit stayed with me long after my body had changed. It took time to see that balance wasn't only weakened by age, but by inattention. I noticed it most when I felt unsteady for no obvious reason. I hadn't tripped, nothing was in my way, yet my footing felt unsure. When I looked closer, I saw that my mind was usually somewhere else. I was thinking ahead, replaying conversations, rushing through moments as if speed itself were a measure of worth. My body was following instructions. It could no longer carry out safely, so I began to slow the world down, not by force, but by attention. Standing became something I noticed. How my feet met the floor. Whether my weight leaned forward or settled evenly. Whether my knees were locked or relaxed. These details had always been there, but I had never listened to them. Now they became signals, gentle guides reminding me how to stay aligned. Walking changed too. I stopped pushing myself to keep pace with younger bodies or old expectations. I let my steps become deliberate, heel first, then the rest of the foot, letting the ground support me fully before lifting the other leg. My arms began to move naturally again, counterbalancing my steps instead of hanging stiffly at my sides. I felt taller, not because I forced my posture, but because I stopped collapsing inward. Posture, I learned, isn't about discipline. It's about balance between effort and ease. When I tried too hard to stand straight, my body grew tense and unstable. When I allowed my spine to lengthen naturally, with my head resting easily above my shoulders, balance followed. It felt less like holding myself up and more like being held. Turning became another moment of awareness. I noticed how often I twisted my upper body while my feet lagged behind. That quick, careless movement was subtle but risky. Now when I turn with my whole body, feet, hips, shoulders moving together. It feels slower, but it feels safer. And safety brings calm, which brings steadiness. There was dignity in this attention. It wasn't self-conscious or fearful, it was respectful. Paying attention to how I stood and walked was a way of acknowledging that my body deserved care, not criticism. I wasn't correcting mistakes, I was listening for balance. This awareness carried into everyday moments. Waiting in line, standing at the sink, pausing at a crosswalk instead of shifting impatiently or leaning on one hip. I stood evenly, letting both feet support me. These quiet moments became practice, not exercises, but opportunities to stay connected. What surprised me most was how quickly confidence returned. Not the bold confidence of youth, but a quieter one. The confidence that comes from knowing where your body is in space, from trusting that your next step will land where you expect it to. Fear loses its power when movement becomes intentional. I also noticed how rushing disrupted balance more than almost anything else. Hurrying tightened my muscles and shortened my steps. It pulled my center of gravity forward, away from stability. Slowing down wasn't a concession, it was a correction. When I allowed myself time, balance followed naturally. There was no finish line here, no point where I mastered how to stand or walk. This was an ongoing conversation. Some days I felt more aware than others. But even on distracted days, the habit of attention softened missteps before they became problems. In paying attention, I reclaimed ownership of my movement. Balance stopped being something I worried about losing and became something I actively participated in. Each step became a small act of care. Each pause, a reminder that I didn't need to rush through my life to prove I was still living it. As this awareness settled in, I began to see how much my surroundings influenced the way I moved. The spaces I lived in either supported this careful attention or worked against it, and that realization led me to the next quiet habit that protected my balance more than I ever expected. For years, I thought of my home as the safest place I knew. I could move through it in the dark, find what I needed without looking, step around furniture by memory alone. Familiarity gave me confidence. But as my balance began to require more care, I discovered that familiarity can also hide small dangers. The very spaces that felt most comfortable were the ones I navigated on autopilot. And autopilot, I learned, doesn't always serve a changing body well. The first time I felt unsure in my own home, it startled me. Not because I nearly fell, but because I realized how much I had been relying on habit instead of awareness. A shadow at the end of the hallway, a rug that had shifted slightly, a lamp that didn't quite light the space the way it used to. None of these were dramatic problems on their own, but together they created uncertainty. Balance thrives on predictability, and my home, without my noticing, had become less predictable than I assumed. I didn't respond by turning my home into something unfamiliar or clinical. I responded by making it honest. An honest home doesn't pretend risks don't exist. It quietly removes unnecessary surprises. It allows movement to be smooth instead of cautious. Small changes made a large difference. Clear pathways meant I could walk without weaving. Furniture stayed where my body expected it to be. Nothing demanded a sudden adjustment in the middle of a step. Lighting became one of the most powerful changes. As eyesight shifts with age, dim corners become more than an inconvenience. They become sources of tension. I noticed how often I tensed my body when moving through low light, bracing for what I couldn't quite see. By making sure light was even and reliable, especially in places I walked through often, that tension eased. When the eyes feel secure, the body follows. Routines played an important role as well. Knowing where things lived and returning them to the same place each day reduced unnecessary reaching and searching. When the body doesn't have to compensate for surprise, balance becomes less of a conscious effort. I could move naturally again without scanning the room for hazards or bracing myself for the unexpected. I also paid attention to surfaces. Chairs that slid slightly when I leaned on them, mats that curled at the edges. Small things that once felt harmless took on new meaning. Adjusting them wasn't an admission of weakness. It was an acknowledgement of reality. Balance isn't about bravery. It's about alignment between body and environment. There was something deeply calming about knowing my home was working with me. The mind relaxed. Movement slowed naturally without becoming hesitant. I stopped gripping the floor with my toes without realizing it. I stopped holding my breath while walking from one room to another. These small releases made a noticeable difference in how steady I felt. What I came to understand is that balance is never just personal. It's relational. It exists between the body and the space it moves through. When that space is thoughtful, balance feels supported rather than strained. My home began to feel more peaceful, not because it was perfect, but because it was considerate. Each change was a quiet agreement to protect my independence rather than test it. I wasn't preparing for the worst. I was creating conditions for the best possible days. As this sense of support settled in, something else became clear. Even in a safe environment, balance could still falter when the mind was scattered or tense. The body could only be as steady as the attention guiding it, and so the focus shifted inward, toward the habits of thought and calm that quietly hold everything together. By the time my home felt supportive and my movements more intentional, I expected balance to feel settled. In many ways it did, but there were still days when steadiness slipped away for reasons I couldn't see on the surface. My footing would feel uncertain even in familiar spaces. My steps would shorten, my shoulders would tighten. When I paid closer attention, I realized the difference wasn't in my body at all. It was in my mind. Balance, I came to understand, is deeply influenced by what the mind is doing at the moment the body moves. On days when my thoughts were scattered, my movements followed suit. When my attention jumped ahead or lingered behind, my body lost its sense of center. The connection between mental calm and physical stability was impossible to ignore once I noticed it. For most of my life, I treated the mind as something separate from the body. Thoughts happened upstairs, movement happened downstairs. Aging gently corrected that illusion. The mind and body are in constant conversation, and when that conversation becomes hurried or tense, balance is often the first thing to suffer. I noticed it while multitasking, carrying something while thinking about the next task, walking while replaying a difficult conversation, standing while worrying about time. These moments seemed harmless, but they pulled my attention away from where my body was actually placed. My feet were on the floor, but my mind was already somewhere else. Balance doesn't tolerate absence very well, so I began to experiment with presence, not in a formal way and not with lofty goals, just simple moments of full attention. Before standing up, I paused and noticed my breath. Before walking, I let my weight settle evenly through my feet. Before turning, I allowed myself a moment to orient. These pauses were brief, almost invisible, but they changed the quality of movement completely. Calm, I learned, isn't something you achieve by force. It emerges when you give yourself permission to slow your thoughts. When I stopped rushing mentally, my body followed. My steps lengthened naturally. My posture softened. My balance improved without effort. Routine became a powerful ally in this process. Not rigid schedules, but gentle rhythms that reduced mental noise. Mornings that began the same way each day created a sense of stability before the world made its demands. Familiar sequences of activity meant fewer decisions, fewer distractions, fewer moments where the mind pulled away from the body. Reflection played an important role as well. Aging brings change, and resisting that change creates tension that settles into the body. When I fought against limitations or compared myself to who I used to be, my movements grew tight and uncertain. When I accepted where I was, balance felt easier. Emotional steadiness translated directly into physical steadiness. I also learned to notice the impact of worry. Fear of falling, in particular, has a way of creating the very instability it seeks to avoid. When fear tightened my muscles, my movements became jerky and cautious. When I acknowledged fear without letting it take control, my body moved more freely. Calm doesn't mean pretending risks don't exist. It means meeting them without panic. Quiet moments throughout the day became opportunities to reset. Sitting in a chair and feeling the support beneath me. Standing by a window and breathing slowly. Letting my eyes rest instead of constantly scanning. These moments weren't escapes from life. They were anchors within it. The more I practiced mental steadiness, the more I noticed its effects beyond balance. I felt less fatigued, less reactive, more grounded. Movement became something I trusted again, not because nothing could go wrong, but because I was present enough to respond if it did. Attention also changed how I related to my body. Instead of seeing it as something that needed managing or correcting, I began to experience it as a partner. When my mind stayed with my body, balance felt like cooperation rather than control. Distraction, I realized, was one of the quietest threats to balance. Not danger in the dramatic sense, but erosion. Little moments of inattention adding up. By gently reducing unnecessary noise, internal and external, I gave my balance room to strengthen. This wasn't about eliminating thought or emotion. It was about giving each moment the attention it deserved. When the mind settled into the present, the body found its center. As mental steadiness became more familiar, I noticed something else shift. I became more comfortable with pacing myself, with listening to signals instead of overriding them, with adjusting my rhythm without feeling diminished. And that understanding led naturally to the final habit that has protected my balance more than any object ever could. The last lesson came quietly, the way the most important ones often do. It didn't arrive as a sudden realization or a clear decision. It emerged slowly, through moments of fatigue, through subtle warnings from my body, through a growing understanding that strength and stubbornness are not the same thing. For a long time, I confused them. I believed that pushing through discomfort was a sign of resilience, that slowing down meant surrendering ground I wasn't ready to give up. Aging taught me otherwise. There was a period when I ignored the early signals, the slight wobble at the end of the day, the heaviness in my legs that asked for rest, the mental fog that made attention harder to maintain. None of these felt serious on their own, so I dismissed them. I told myself I was fine, that I'd always managed before. But balance doesn't fail all at once. It erodes when wisdom is ignored. What changed was not a fall, but the awareness that I was coming close to choices I might regret. I realized that insisting on moving at the same pace with the same expectations was no longer an act of courage. It was an act of denial. and denial when it comes to balance is far more dangerous than caution. Slowing down did not mean stopping. It meant learning to recognize when my body needed a different rhythm. Some days asked for less. Some moments asked for pause. Honoring those requests became a form of self-preservation rather than self-limitation. I began to see rest differently, not as an interruption, but as part of movement itself. Sitting down before exhaustion set in allowed me to stand again with steadiness. Pausing between tasks prevented the accumulation of fatigue that quietly undermines balance. These pauses were not signs of weakness, they were signs of awareness. There was also an emotional component to slowing down. Pride can be a heavy thing to carry as we age. The desire to appear capable, unchanged, independent at all costs. Letting go of that performance was one of the hardest adjustments I made. But once I did, movement felt lighter. I stopped proving and started preserving. Adaptation became a form of intelligence, choosing a steadier route instead of the shortest one, allowing extra time instead of rushing, accepting help when it made sense without attaching shame to it. Each adaptation protected my independence rather than threatening it. Balance improved because I was no longer fighting reality. I learned to trust that slowing down in one area allowed me to keep going in others. Energy conserved through wise pacing showed up later as confidence, as steadiness, as the ability to participate fully in what mattered most. Life didn't shrink when I slowed down. It clarified. There were moments when frustration surfaced, when I missed the ease of earlier years, when patience felt thin. In those moments, I reminded myself that balance is not about speed, it's about continuity. The ability to keep moving through life with dignity, even as the terrain changes. Listening to my body became an act of respect. Early signals were no longer inconveniences to ignore. They were information to consider. When I honored them, balance stayed intact. When I ignored them, uncertainty followed. The choice became clear. Slowing down also deepened my relationship with time. I stopped measuring days by how much I fit into them, and started measuring them by how present I felt while living them. That presence carried into movement. Each step felt more grounded, each transition more deliberate. I noticed that fear lost its urgency when I moved at a pace that matched my capacity. Falls are often associated with suddenness, with pushing past limits without realizing it. By staying within my rhythm, I reduced those moments of surprise. Balance thrives in predictability, not pressure. There was dignity in this shift, a quiet dignity that didn't need validation. I was no longer trying to outrun age or outpace change. I was walking alongside it, attentive, adaptable, and steady. In the end, these habits didn't make me immune to aging. They made me resilient within it. Balance became something I protected daily, not through tools or devices, but through awareness, environment, calm, and wisdom. I still use support when I need it. There is no shame in that, but long before any cane entered my life, these habits had already been doing the deeper work. They protected my confidence, they preserved my independence, they allowed me to move through my days with a sense of control that comes not from force, but from understanding. Balance, I've learned, is not something you hold on to tightly. It's something you care for gently, day after day, by listening to who you are now and honoring what that requires.